Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Title Scoop. So this week we're going to continue our talks on RESPA, TILA, and TRID. Last week we reviewed how TRID came about, what requirements were for notice, and what documents we see when we're doing a TRID closing that the buyer receives. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens if something changes, what happens if there's a variance, and we'll go over what that is, and then what documents the seller will receive. So let's start out with what happens if something changes. So a change is something that happens that basically makes the lender have to redo the CD and start the 3-day period over. And we talked about that 3-day period last week. And those changes are something, the ones that we see the most are there's an APR change, there's a loan product change, so maybe they went from fixed to variable, or maybe they added a prepayment penalty, in which case that would change the CD and they would need to start their 3 days over and give the CD to the buyer. So the documents that we talked about for the buyer last week, the only document that we actually are required by TRID to give to the seller is the closing disclosure, the seller CD. And the settlement agent, so us, we are required to provide that seller CD to the seller no later than the day of closing. I find that kind of funny because I would hope that they would have their CD prior to closing, but I just thought that the rule is kind of funny that we may have to make sure they have it the day of closing. Usually that's in a separate document. You can combine the CDs, but from what I've seen in practice, most people don't because that buyer CD has a lot of information in there that they don't probably want the seller to know. So usually you see a buyer CD and a seller CD, in which case, if you do the seller CD separately, you need to send that to the lender on top of sending it to the seller. So let's talk about variances before and after closing. So first off, a variance occurs when an actual charge is greater than the estimated charge. Now, variances are permitted if the consumer picks that service provider on their own without a list from a lender or referral or anything like that. So those variances are okay. Again, there's a lot more specifics if you want to read into what variances, what fees and what service providers actually fall into the variances. I'm not going to go into that today, but it is something that you can read up on. And if you want any information on it, let me know. Variances within 10% are permitted when any fees charged by the service provider are from a service provider selected by the consumer from the lender's approved list of providers. So if the lender provided this list and then the consumer picks someone off of there and there's a variance, you've got a 10% variance rate. Now, there's a zero tolerance on any change in fees charged by the service providers that the consumers cannot select or shop. And the one that comes up probably the most on that is estimated transfer taxes. And those fall into a zero tolerance. So if the transfer tax changes, then we have to do something with that variance, and there's a zero tolerance. Now, variance is after closing. So creditors must provide a corrected CD if an event in connection with the settlement occurs within a 30-day period after closing. And basically what happens is the settlement agent has to provide and deliver the corrected CD to the seller. The lender's responsible for the buyer, but a lot of times, again, they're going to reach out to you. They're going to give you the guidance. You don't have to necessarily know what those variances are, but some examples that you might see would maybe be overcharge of recording fees, refunds that might benefit the consumer, or let me see if there's anything else. I've got a list here I'm looking to see. Sometimes clerical errors, just depends on what the fee is. And anyway, refunds for tolerance variations must be documented no later than 60 days. Again, that's going to be on the lender for the most part, but they're usually going to be working with you side by side to make sure that they're getting the updated CDs. So the last document we're going to talk about is the ALTA closing statement. This document is not required, but a lot of companies use it basically to accompany the CDs because they found it's just a little bit easier to go over, a little bit easier to have all the numbers on one document versus having separate CDs, and it doesn't have any confidential information on it. So ALTA actually created this form when TRID was being implemented in 2010 just to make it a little bit easier, and it really has a look and feel of the HUD-1. So that's why people like it and why they use it. The one thing that I usually try to tell people and to make sure they do is if you're doing a separate ALTA closing statement, those numbers have to match your CDs. So they have to be exact. You can't have anything different on your ALTA statement versus your CD. So that's the big rule. If you're going to use it, it has to match. With that, I don't think I have anything else. If you guys have any questions about RESPA, TILA, and TRID, let me know. Otherwise, we will probably be on a new escrow topic next week. We'll see you soon.